Denver Broncos reigning, defending Defensive Player of the Year, Patrick Surtain, could be in line for a second DPOY award if he wins these three top matchups in 2025. We'll highlight that and more on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Broncos Country, what's happening? Welcome into another episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where you know it's your team every day for all your Broncos news, content, coverage, analysis, and more. This is the place to be every single day, all year long. A special shout out to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country. Thanks for tuning in, making us your first listen, however you choose to do so. And if you're not yet an everydayer, become one. Hit that subscribe or that follow button. That way you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports.
And I'm Sayre Bedinger, side expert at predominantlyorange.com.
And if Broncos cornerback Patrick Surtain II is going to win his second Defensive Player of the Year award here in 2025, there are going to be three matchups that he'll have this upcoming season. And if he wins those, it'll elevate his chances significantly. We'll go through and talk about A.J. Brown, a tough matchup between PS2 and him in Week 5 when the Broncos take on the Philadelphia Eagles. Plus, we'll also go through a rematch with Ja'Marr Chase in Week 4, where the Broncos cornerback in the prior two matchups has had his way with Ja'Marr Chase, who just got the mega bag in Cincinnati. And then we'll debate and discuss whether or not CeeDee Lamb or Terry McLaurin will be the next toughest receiver that PS2 faces this upcoming season. Sarah, I always like these kinds of pieces here because really beginning next week is when we dive deeper into every Broncos training camp position preview that leads Broncos Country right up into the start of training camp. We're excited about all that. But before we get to that, I think some of these offseason material things could be fun, right? Where we highlight some of these key matchups. We've looked at maybe the top three offenses the Broncos, will face, or the defenses that they'll face in 2025. But I feel like when we look at PS2 here, I think it's a great topic to kind of discuss maybe some of these top wide receivers that he'll face this upcoming season. A.J. Brown in Week 5, honestly, on paper, seems like it is the heavyweight matchup of the year between the Broncos all-pro cornerback and obviously the stud, talented Super Bowl wide receiver that is A.J. Brown.
And it also kind of feels like the Eagles might present the Broncos with their biggest challenge defensively in terms of the best players that they'll face, like on the same field at the same time at running back, receiver, tight end. I don't know that any team they're facing this year, Cody, has a better trio, or I guess quartet, if you want to call it that, for the Eagles, because they have two receivers that are really good. But yeah, A.J. Brown, since that trade with the Tennessee Titans a couple of years ago that got so many people fired there, he's been dominant, just downright dominant. And he can win a variety of different ways after the catch, at the catch point. He can burn you with speed. He's just so good all around. And he's developed into one of those players who, I don't want to say he's a cheat code or anything, Cody, because there's certain weeks that he's not even the primary receiver there. But most weeks, I feel like you can count on him being a high volume, highly effective target every single time Jalen Hurts throws him the football. And so you want your best on best. And that means that somebody's got to step up on the other side of the ball, right? Where, or on the other side of the field where Devontae Smith is playing. And he's a very good receiver as well. So Pat, like you said, if he wants to repeat as Defensive Player of the Year, these types of matchups are going to dictate whether or not that happens, right? Against A.J. Brown, if you can put the clamps on and dominate this kind of a game, Cody, I feel like that'll be, especially being this is in Week 5, I feel like it'll be a great early season statement for the reigning Defensive Player of the Year.
And it could elevate his stock significantly too early on. Like, people are going to be looking at those conversations like matchups of the week. I feel like A.J. Brown, PS2. Sarah, I would pay money to be able to see that matchup in person. I mean, luckily I get to see it with a press pass, but I mean, that's worth the price of admission. I think if you're a Broncos fan going to Philadelphia here in that situation, a thing I like about Pat in this matchup too is the fact that I think we'll see him play press coverage quite a bit here on A.J. Brown. And they'll move A.J. around, but primarily he'll be an outside guy. They'll move him. Pat will follow there. But it's also some of those other names that you mentioned you have to account for. Devontae Smith, obviously a former Alabama teammate of Patrick Surtain. And the first matchup I think that PS2 ever had against D. Smith, remember, I think this was in Denver where he just hauled in an incredible catch for a touchdown. It was really great coverage, but kind of mossed PS2 for a TD in that game where I think Teddy Bridgewater threw the ball out of the end zone on fourth down, like threw it in the back of the end zone, like threw the ball away on fourth down. And I remember that caused a bunch of controversy. Luckily, we are far ahead of those conversations here on this show. But that is the pay-per-view matchup, in my opinion. If I have to look at any matchup on the schedule for the Broncos, this will be the toughest for them as a team because of what you mentioned here. But for Patrick Surtain to elevate maybe a defensive player of the year case once again, I think how he does against A.J. Brown will set the tone for the rest of the way because, in my opinion, the physicality and the size and, as you mentioned, that explosiveness that a guy like A.J. Brown has, look, that's the one I think is going to be intriguing. Obviously, we're going to talk about another matchup coming up in week 4. The week prior to this matchup here, PS2 is going to get back-to-back tough matchups, on a week-to-week basis there. But I feel like this is the biggest one of the season. Now, on the flip side of that, too, PS2 could essentially completely erase a player like A.J. Brown, hypothetically, right? But then you factor in Saquon Barkley, Jalen Hurts, the dynamic of those guys with their legs on the ground, Dallas Goedert. But I also think when you look at the wide receiver position, this is where these offseason additions of Talanoa Hufanga, Jahdae Barron, the continued development and ascension of Riley Moss, Jaquan McMillan are going to be so big because outside of Devontae Smith, they also have Jahan Dotson, who is going to be a welcome addition inside that offense, not to mention Dallas Goedert at tight end. This is where some of these other matchups could come in and maybe impact the Broncos negatively, even if Pat Surtain takes away what A.J. Brown can do.
Yeah, you're going to be expecting that the ball is going to be distributed all over the place. I mean, Nick Sirianni, I don't know what the situation is going to be there this year, Cody, in terms of who's calling the plays and things like that, but he's going to want to get all those guys involved, and he's going to play the chess match just like everybody else does against Denver. But I do think that one of the interesting things that as we look through this, I guess sort of a really tough slate of matchups for PS2, doesn't that kind of lead to, I mean, for a corner like PS2, it can be almost easy for teams on a week-to-week basis to say, we're not throwing his direction. We're going to avoid throwing it over there as much as we possibly can. But when you have playmakers that you're going up against, like A.J. Brown or the guys that we're going to talk about coming up on today's episode, teams don't avoid getting those guys targets. Teams will, like the Eagles are not going to avoid getting A.J. Brown targets. So it gives PS2 an opportunity to make more plays on the ball, which I think last year, I mean, he had 2 interceptions in that Raiders game and he had the interceptions against the Colts. I just feel like for him, it's an opportunity to go say, all right, I'm not only going to put the clamps on these guys, but knowing that they're going to throw the ball A.J. Brown's direction, I'm going to go make a play on the ball. I'm going to make him pay for throwing the ball to A.J. Brown. Not only am I going to nullify his presence on the field, but I'm going to actively make it a net negative. That's why I think PS2 can really make his case for defensive MVP once again this season, is not just low yards per attempt, low yards per completion into his coverage, bad quarterback rating when you target PS2. How about take the ball back and create some points for your team that way? I think that's one. I mean, we put a lot of pressure on this guy anyway. Why not apply a little bit more?
No, look, he's looking forward to this upcoming season. I had a chance to catch up with Pat over the weekend at his youth football camp that he put on in Parker, Colorado. And one of the things that he said was, why not win another defensive player of the year? But really the goal for him is what he said is, our goal is to win a Super Bowl. He said, that's what we really want to do. He said, while winning defensive player of the year was nice, our goal is much bigger than that. Our goal as a team collectively is to go out there and win a Super Bowl. And look, if the Broncos are going to get that far and be able to do that, Pat's contributions defensively, they've been so big, but they'll be even bigger if the Broncos can go on a run inside of the playoffs. I think being able to do that is taking care of big-time matchups, showing you can compete against Super Bowl teams like the Philadelphia Eagles in Week 5. But let us know, Broncos Country, your thoughts on the looming A.J. Brown versus PS2 matchup that could be a highlight-worthy performance for the Broncos and for PS2 if they can come away with the advantage there in Week 5. Let us know your thoughts tonight here on today's episode of the show. But we're going to tell you why coming up next, a rematch with Ja'Marr Chase will also elevate that stock because that comes before the A.J. Brown matchup. But PS2, he's had Ja'Marr Chase's number, and that trend will likely continue in 2025. You'll get that here on today's episode of the show.
Today's episode of Locked On Broncos is brought to you by Monarch Money. Ever wish managing your money felt easier? Well, with Monarch Money, It can. Whether you're growing your savings or planning a big purchase, Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. And Monarch Money, it's so much more than just a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center where you can track all your accounts, your investments, and your spending in just one place. So in addition to managing your money, you're also building wealth.
And you're gaining key insights into your spending habits as well. And that could be good or bad, especially if you're trying to save money. And tell you what, I came away a little flabbergasted at how much I was spending on coffee or food takeout delivery services directly to my door. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com. Code LOCKEDONNFL for half off your first year.
Ja'Marr Chase is going to have to face off against Pat Surtain once again this coming season. How are the Broncos going to fare this time around? They struggled a little bit against that Bengals passing attack, but certainly, as Cody mentioned before, Ja'Marr Chase didn't have a ton of success when he was matched up against PS2. The Broncos are going to look to make sure that they exploit that matchup in their favor once again here in 2025. And why is Ja'Marr Chase maybe the toughest receiver that the Broncos will face all year? We're going to tell you all about that on today's episode. Broncos Country, thanks so much for making us your first listen of the day every single day. We appreciate every single one of you. Cody, last season, Ja'Marr Chase in that overtime thriller between the Broncos and Bengals, he did have 9 catches for 102 yards, 11.3 yards per catch. His catch percentage, though, in that game of 60% was the lowest number. That was the lowest percentage of receptions per target that he had all year long. I'm interested to know your takeaways from that game as far as like in the moment when we're reacting to those types of games. It's not necessarily we're sitting there like, man, Pat Surtain really had a great game. I mean, we're obviously talking about the result of the game, the implications of the playoffs, but now it's the offseason. We had time to go back and watch that game probably a number of times at this point. Why do you think Pat Surtain has the advantage against a receiver as dynamic as Ja'Marr Chase?
Well, it just seems like every time Pat's lined up against him, there isn't an efficiency level, I think, for the offense when it is that. You know, one thing the Cincinnati Bengals tried to do was scheme him open on pick plays, deep crossing routes, right? They'd try to catch the Broncos or Pat maybe off-ball coverage, and they would do that based on trying to condense the splits of their wide receivers, right? Make everything tight and congested, which makes it easier to create clear outs, rubs, picks by the receivers that would make Pat have to impede through traffic to be able to get into hip positioning against a guy like Ja'Marr Chase. That's why Denver tried to press a lot. Now, obviously, that production that Ja'Marr Chase had in that game, it really wasn't against Pat Surtain here because according to our friends over there at NFL Next Gen Stats, Pat Surtain in that game in the overtime loss that the Broncos had, he was on Ja'Marr Chase on 43 of 56 coverage snaps, and he held him specifically to 3 catches total for 27 yards. Now let's rewind a little bit to Pat's rookie year, right? 2021, the Bengals come to town. This is, obviously the Drew Lock fumble game where the Broncos, if they win that game, they could have made it to the playoffs that season with Vic Fangio here. What I found to be interesting in that game, it was really Tyler Boyd who really carved up the Broncos. And it wasn't against PS2 because PS2 was on Ja'Marr Chase in that game. PS2 held Ja'Marr Chase in that game specifically to 1 catch for 3 yards here. And I think the tough part about this and looking in hindsight, because this applies to 2024, Pat was all over the place. Pat did really well against T. Higgins. He even punched the ball out, forced a fumble on T. Higgins in that game last year. Did a really good job of erasing Ja'Marr Chase's big-time impact in this game, but it wasn't enough for the Broncos to beat the Cincinnati Bengals, right? Because T. Higgins was going off against Riley Moss, and you had Mike Gesicki going off, almost having 100 yards himself there. I think he had something along the lines of, 10 catches for 86 yards. Andre Yosevas had 3 catches for 59 yards. And Denver's defense, they sacked Joe Burrow 7 times, and they still lost the game. Sayre, to me, that's crazy. And what it tells me here about 2025 is the Broncos, they're going to have to bring a little bit more this upcoming season if they want to win this matchup. But it just goes to show that PS2 has been one of the top dogs in the NFL because he locks down these top-level guys like Ja'Marr Chase. He's 2 for 2 against them right now. And really the trend, I think, isn't going to change here going into this upcoming season. The Broncos are going to ramp up pressure on Joe Burrow, and I guarantee you they're going to probably try to target T. Higgins quite a bit in this game. But the The Bengals, they did make some new additions as well. They have added to that receiving and that tight end room.
Yeah, they've got a lot of really good players there once again. And obviously Joe Burrow pulling the trigger on those passes. He is one of the best, as we talked about, quarterbacks in the NFL today. Arguably, in my opinion, Cody, I think if I had to say, hey, you got one shot to go win a Super Bowl and you need a quarterback to do it for you, I think Joe Burrow would probably be my guy, honestly, over a 4-quarter game. And I like him a lot. And I think that he's great, but you obviously want to see him fail in a situation like this. And Pat Surtain is the guy who's going to help the Broncos do it. You want those other DBs to take that next step so that Burrow's not just constantly finding, because like you mentioned in the episode that we did about the quarterbacks, which everybody should go listen to, Broncos sacked Joe Burrow 7 times and still he's able to throw for an astronomical number of yards, converting on third downs time and time again, and then obviously putting his team in position to win late. And Jamar Chase is a big reason for that. And the familiarity between Jamar Chase and Pat Surtain is so deeply rooted too, right? I mean, these guys came into the NFL, I believe, in the same year, if memory serves me right, Cody, because they were both class of 2021. And they played in the SEC together. Jamar Chase at LSU, Pat Surtain at Alabama. So their rivalry goes deeper than just the matchups they've had in the NFL. They've had matchups at the college level. They probably knew each other back in high school, I'm sure. And Cody, like that type of stuff, that familiarity between guys like this, it can breed some contempt, right? Especially when it's been a little bit more one-sided in terms of, all right, Pat's winning the matchups, but then Jamar is the guy who's getting to celebrate the victory. So I don't know. Maybe the Broncos need to let Jamar Chase go wild one of these games, and maybe they'll win one. I don't know what's the key here, Cody. But Pat Surtain has obviously got a lot of familiarity with this guy, and it doesn't seem like Jamar Chase has been able to crack the code.
No, you know, he did crack and break the bank though. Obviously, with the record-setting contract extension at wide receiver, and that I think is, you know, where the benefit of what the Bengals are able to do is they have ridiculous explosive firepower on offense. I think right now you look on paper, you can look at the Baltimore Ravens as a team in that category, but I also look primarily at the Cincinnati Bengals as probably the most dangerous, most explosive offense right now in the NFL, at least on paper. And I would say when you look at those Ravens and Bengals matchups from last season, they were the highest scoring games that you would see all year long on the NFL, right? Whether it was a Sunday or whether it was a Thursday night matchup, it was what I think on average was like a 41-38 final score. And, you know, at a good portion of those games, that's the thing though. Like that's where Denver needs these other guys to step up, because if you do have a guy like Pat, who in 2 matchups, essentially, like when Pat's covering him, can erase that efficiency that Jamar has, and other guys are thriving like Tyler Boyd did in 2021. I can't even remember now. Was it who was the outside corner? Because I think Kyle Fuller was hurt at one point. Because I know Bryce was playing in the nickel, Bryce Callahan. I'm trying to remember who else stepped in 2021.
Let's take a gander.
Wasn't Ronald Darby, was it?
It could have been.
I think it was Darby.
Yeah, let's pull it up here because I've got the old trusty dusty hour.
Breaking out the history notes.
We're breaking out the history. Okay, so we've got here's the corners on the roster at that time: Kyle Fuller, Bryce Callahan, Pat Surtain, Kerry Vincent, Nate Hairston, and Ronald Darby. So it might have been even Hairston, Cody. He played quite a bit that season. If maybe it was a different one, but I remember him playing quite a bit at one point.
Nuts. It takes it all the way back. I would say arguably now Denver's got a more, I'd say, solidified, more impactful depth outlook on that room right now than they did there. Though I think those veteran additions, Bryce Callahan was great for Denver. Injuries, obviously, a little bit of a bigger factor. Kyle Fuller, his time in Denver was not so great. You know, the Broncos did not get the guy they initially were looking for there. But I think that Denver in the secondary, they're much better now than they were then. I think they're better right now on paper than they were in 2024 as well. So I'm very curious to see how that maybe transitions over here when we look at this matchup. I want to ask you your quick opinion on this too. And Broncos Country, feel free to chime in as you're tuning into today's episode of the show. We talked about A.J. Brown. I feel like you can make an argument that Jamar Chase or A.J. Brown, these guys will be the toughest matchup for Pat this season. Where are you leaning? Is it A.J. Brown or is it Jamar?
I think it's Jamar. I really do. I mean, this is a guy, first team All-Pro last year, over 1,700 yards, 100 yards per game. I mean, that's basically he averaged a touchdown a game. He had 17 touchdowns. I think when you can average 100 yards and a touchdown a game at the NFL level, you're just playing on a different plane than everybody else. You are dominant in every way. And that's not to take away from AJ Brown either. I just think that Ja'Marr Chase is one of those guys who you can trust him with 15 plus targets every single week, and you know that he's going to deliver, and he's just so consistent. And so to me, I think Cody, other than Justin Jefferson, it's crazy to think those two guys were on the same team at the college level. It's no wonder they ran the table the way that they did. But yeah, I'd say Ja'Marr Chase, Justin Jefferson, those are the two best receivers in the game right now.
Broncos Country, make sure you let us know your thoughts here on today's episode of the show. Sayre and I, we had a very difficult time really trying to pinpoint that exact third guy. Who's the third toughest matchup for Pat Surtain? There's three names that we're going to look at: CeeDee Lamb, Terry McLaurin, and Nico Collins. Where are we leaning on this? We'll dive into that here on today's episode of the show. Is it Nico Collins, scary Terry McLaurin, or is it CeeDee Lamb that will be the third toughest matchup here for Patrick Surtain II in 2025 as he looks to maybe win another Defensive Player of the Year award and help get the Broncos to a potential Super Bowl bid? That's the aspiration of the team. And if the Broncos are going to make it that far, they have to showcase that they can shut down and lock down some of the top players in the NFL, which Pat, he's consistently done that in his elite level career early on here. But now, really, we've talked about A.J. Brown. We've talked about Ja'Marr Chase. I think Broncos Country will have the easy consensus that those will be the top two receivers that Denver faces this year that Pat has to cover. I've found it very hard looking at the schedule and really trying to identify a solidified third option, Sayre. So let's take a look at CeeDee Lamb, Nico Collins, or even scary Terry McLaurin. Do you think it's of those three, or is there a name that I'm missing that you feel like will be the one to watch for?
No, I like those names. I don't know that there's very many receivers that you would go up against better than CeeDee Lamb. I think to me, maybe the perception on him is a little bit off based on last year, Cody, where obviously the Cowboys were cycling through Cooper Rush, and their quarterback situation hasn't been the most stable with Dak being hurt as much as he has been. And so I just think you go back to 2022, 2023, you look at CeeDee Lamb's dominance in those two seasons when Dak was mostly healthy. This guy was first-team All-Pro in 2023. He was third in the Offensive Player of the Year voting. He's been a three-time All-Pro selection in a row, even with the injury, to Dak Prescott last season. So to me, CeeDee Lamb is that guy, and I think that he's just borne such a heavy burden on his back as the sole producer in that offense over the last couple of seasons. And now he's got some help with George Pickens. So I think that with Pickens in Dallas and a healthy Dak Prescott, that team all of a sudden becomes vastly different in my eyes. But CeeDee Lamb is he's still the one who's going to make everything go. He's still the catalyst for that team. He's going to still get his targets. He's going to be the featured guy. And I think to me, he is the best receiver other than the two guys we've talked about on Denver's schedule this season.
I can see a legit case for that too. And let's talk about George Pickens here for a little bit, because obviously while Pickens' stats against Denver when Surtain was covering him weren't effective, I remember there being at least 2 or 3 plays that got called back due to a Steelers penalty where Pickens made some big plays downfield. Pat was in coverage, and there was a mixed variance between man and zone coverage there, but ultimately those plays did not count. George Pickens certainly throws a wrinkle into the mix as well, because now I think you're in a situation very similar to like Ja'Marr Chase, T. Higgins, when you played the Cowboys, that, okay, hey, you got to worry about obviously Pickens, CeeDee Lamb. We'll see where Dak's at. Obviously that whole roller coaster is always something that gives back to a Cowboys nation, as Jerry would say. I'm really excited about Dak, and we get CD in the mix a little bit, like good old Jerry Jones, man. Always great for something.
It's good.
Hey, spontaneous, let's see. No one's seen me and Jerry Jones in the same room ever, so we'll see where things are at. All right, so I agree with you. I do feel like CeeDee Lamb is probably the next best name, right? That you're going to have to go against if you're Pat here. I want to throw some honorable mentions in there too. We talked about Terry McLaurin. Obviously, there's some dysfunction with Terry McLaurin and the Commanders this offseason as they're looking for a new deal. So I'm not sure if that will impact things or if they're going to be able to pay him here. But I always look at it as, hey, Denver's playing them on Sunday Night Football. Bo Nix against Jaden Daniels, 2 second-year quarterbacks, 2 guys who are in the Offensive Rookie of the Year category here. And for the Broncos, they have a really great chance to go out there defensively and showcase, like, hey, we're going to go out there and mess with Jaden Daniels. We're going to take away his top options here. We're going to elevate Bo in the meantime by doing that. Terry McLaurin is tough. And I remember when the Broncos played him and Sean Payton's first year, he had a couple of crazy catches, including an impactful touchdown that ultimately resulted in the Broncos collapsing after a 21-3 lead at halftime in that game. I remember that clearly. Scary Terry is an accelerator for a guy like Jaden Daniels. And, of course, they got Deebo Samuel in the mix as well. So 2 other guys, 2 receivers that if you're Denver, you have to kind of worry about.
Yeah, and I think Terry McLaurin is one of those guys who, on a per target basis, I don't know that many guys are quite as effective. Every time the ball goes his direction, it just feels like something good is going to happen, doesn't it? I mean, he's the deep ball master in today's NFL. He can absolutely turn a throw that otherwise you would say, oh wow, he's almost trying to throw it away, or he's putting it. He's the master of like the catch where the announcer is going to say, oh, the quarterback put it where only his receiver could get it. That's the kind of catches that I feel like Terry McLaurin makes all the time. And he did last season, a 70.1% catch percentage, which means that he maximized every single target, 82 catches on 117 total targets, 13 touchdowns amongst his 82 catches. So just a really high efficiency and somebody who built, like you said, that chemistry with Jaden Daniels super, super quick. I just saw too, Cody, that Ladd McConkey was on the NFL top 100 players list. So maybe he deserves some love in this conversation. I don't know, but he's tough.
Going to guard him, do you think?
I don't know if PS2 is going to go. I don't know if you need PS2 on Ladd McConkey. I mean, I'm not trying to disrespect.
We didn't see it last
either.
year that much.
No, we didn't. So I think you have the personnel now, especially with Jahdae Barron in the mix, to be able to counter a guy like that playing in the slot. But I don't know if there's anybody else on the schedule who really screams out to me, man, PS2, you have to have him shadowing that guy. I know you mentioned Nico Collins. I do think PS2, you want him on Nico Collins, even though he's not the same as a Jamar Chase or those types of guys. I feel like Nico is one of the more underrated wide receiver 1 type players in the NFL.
He almost contributed $200 on the Broncos in that matchup that they had in Russell Wilson's final year in Denver. That was the reason the Broncos lost that game, was because Nico Collins went absolutely crazy. And I remember Pat hyperextended his knee in that game, and somehow, he came back, I think, a series or 2 after the fact and was able to come in. But you look at Houston as well. They have, I think, an underrated room. Look, Tank Dell is not expected to play this upcoming season after that very scary injury he suffered last year on his leg. And obviously our thoughts and prayers continue to go out to him. Hopefully he can get back on the field. But they add Jaden Higgins in the NFL draft. They signed Christian Kirk, obviously, who was with the Jacksonville Jaguars. And they still have John Mechie III, who I think is a player that is still evolving as well. Like, they have very capable weapons at that wide receiver position. And then at tight end, they still have Dalton Schultz. They also have Cade Stover, Brevin Jordan. They have, and Irv Smith Jr. and Luke Lachey, who obviously I know you like that being an Iowa guy. The Texans on offense, at least at their skill player position, they seem to have some very underrated names, I would say, in comparison to maybe some of the other groups we talked about.
Yeah, they have a lot of underrated playmakers for sure. And I think CJ Stroud's going to have a huge, huge bounce back year, Cody, for them after I feel like a lot of people felt it from the Texans last year, a sophomore slump for kind of that whole team. But I don't know, maybe they take that step back forward this year. I think we got to mention 2 more guys as like honorable mention. These 2 guys were both in the top 7 of all receivers and tight ends last year in receiving yards. The 3rd most receiving yards in the NFL last season, Brian Thomas from the Jacksonville Jaguars. They're on the Broncos schedule late. And then the 7th most was Malik Neighbors, who plays for the New York Giants, and he'll be the number 1 target for our old friend Russell Wilson out there this coming season. And I think, Cody, we'll see Russell Wilson play against the Broncos this time around, but I guess you never know. But I think those 2 guys are entering that conversation as well. I don't think they're quite in the conversation, but I think they're entering the conversation with the Jamar Chase and all those types of other guys at the top of the NFL.
I would say that's fair too. It's also kind of nice that we can approach the season by really looking at like, there's really no one from the Kansas City Chiefs. You're like, you have to respect that room, but it's not like it's going to be the toughest matchup that you have all year, right? Every year when it was Tyreek Hill, like Tyreek was always going to be the toughest matchup that you had on your schedule all year if you're a corner like PS2. And PS2 obviously really limited Tyreek in 2021 when the last time they kind of played as a member of KC versus Denver. So I'm excited about that and where things are at here. But Broncos Country, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on today's episode of the show? The top 3 names you think Pat Surtain will go up against this upcoming season. Make sure you let us know. But for all you everydayers, here's what you can expect on tomorrow's episode of Locked On Broncos. Sayre and myself, we're going to sit down and we're going to tease and maybe figure out what some bold predictions are going to be here for the Broncos offense for Bo Nix. How many passing yards will Bo have this upcoming season? Will he surpass 3,500 yards once again? Will he have more touchdowns than he did in 2025? We think that's the case. Make sure you tune in to tomorrow's episode show to get all that and much more.